Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm David Weaver. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohioana Library in Columbus, Ohio. We're coming to you live tonight from Ohioana. Okay, I'm gonna confess this is my spare bedroom. But it is being presented by the Ohioana Library, and we're delighted that you could join us for a very special evening, a conversation with David Giffels that is built around his new book, Barnstorming Ohio to Understand America. Here it is right here. Um, Fantastic book by David, who is a longtime favorite of the Ohioana Library. He's the winner of 2 Ohioana Book Awards. He's also recipient of the Cleveland Art Prize. He is a journalist, author, a teacher, and at one time was a Pulitzer Prize finalist, and also wrote several episodes of the iconic MTV series Beavis and Butthead. And I always tease David that it's not often in one sentence you can use the words Pulitzer Prize and Butthead. But welcome, David. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm glad that I get to congratulate you in person because I missed last year's award ceremony where you won the award, your second award for your wonderful book about your father, Furnishing Eternity. Welcome.
Thanks, David. It's great to be back with Ohioana, even if it's by way of my attic in Akron, Ohio. So, I always appreciate the time I get to spend with you, though.
Yes. It's the one thing about virtual programming now is that people are seeing the inside of our houses, so it's giving us an extra incentive to keep our houses nice and tidy. But I want to say, because Furnishing Eternity, such a beautiful and personal a book, so well loved by so many people. Our book club, when they read it, loved it and everything. And this new book of yours, Barnstorming Ohio to Understand America, was kind of like a take back to your real roots as a journalist and as an essayist and as an observer, even though it does have some personal elements in it by virtue of the fact, that your daughter Leah and Evan kind of intersect in the story. So I just wanted to know, what was the genesis? What was it that made you start on the path to write this story?
Yeah, it's kind of funny because, and this is kind of like an Ohio thing. When Furnishing Eternity came out, the New York Times reviewed it, and the review referred to me as the Bard of Akron, a nickname I did not seek, and it made me a little self-conscious and cringe in a way. I mean, I'm very proud of the work I've done writing about my hometown and about Ohio, but I thought this might mean I'm pigeonholing myself, because all of my books and all of my journalistic work has focused on Ohio in one way or another. And so in a way, as I was thinking about what I was going to work on next, I was kind of looking for something different, something away from that. And so I started having some conversations with my agent, and this happened to be right after the 2018 midterm elections. And he said, David, like, it just seems like Ohio is always part of this political conversation. And, we're already looking toward the 2020 election. And he was aware of Ohio's unique status up until this year as a sort of reliable predictor of who will be president. Ohio has, up until 2 weeks ago or a week ago, Ohio had accurately voted for the winner in every election except 2 going back to the 19th century. No other state had such a track record. And so it started me thinking about a project I did when I was a columnist for the Akron Beacon Journal all the way back in 2004. In the couple of months leading up to that presidential election, I toured around Ohio with this idea that I wanted to really probe the corners of this swing state that we traditionally have been. And I came away with this very strong impression that I came away understanding Ohioans and Americans much more than I came understanding anything about a presidential election. And so we started talking about that, and we decided, wouldn't it be neat to do that project on a really large scale? And so the guy who was trying to get away from this Ohio theme released this book where like Ohio is the biggest word on the cover. So if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans. So, but as I got into it, like I realized, that even if whatever our bellwether status is, that Ohio still has a lot to say about who Americans are, and kind of where we're headed. As I write in the book, Ohio isn't any more American than any other place, but it is completely so. And I think that remains true.
And that's reflected in the 5 Ohios, and you talk about that, and that within this, and our state is kind of shaped, like I said, like you said, the heart of Ohio, we're kind of shaped like a heart.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because Ohio has just started the Ohioan has just started the Ohio Literary Trail, and we divide the state exactly in those 5 sections because they are, and even the authors come from there. Louis Bromfield, Toni Morris, and James Wright, and Zane Grey. I mean, they're all from different parts of the state. So it's amazing, and yet it all has worked together as this reliable predictor. So I guess the question I would ask you then is, Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton by 8 points in 2016. Last week, he beat Joe Biden by 8 points. So nothing really changed, with the exception that Trump also won Mahoning County, which Hillary Clinton had carried in 2016. So I just want to ask you, was, after now having talked to all of the people and visited the place you did, was last week's outcome a surprise?
Yes, it really was, because the reason Ohio is such a good model for understanding the country in terms of presidential politics is because I mentioned the 5 Ohios, is because it has 5 distinct regions that each vote in different patterns, and each have kind of their own media centers and sort of cultural personality. And each of those 5 regions accurately or neatly mirrors another part of the country. So the Northeast part of Ohio is very similar to the northeastern part of the United States. The Northwest part of Ohio is much more like the American Midwest. Southwest Ohio is more southern. Southeast Ohio is more southern, but also a different kind of southern, a sort of poor Appalachian southern. And then Central Ohio, where you are, is more suburban. It's a growing urban center that's different than the other urban centers in Ohio, which have been losing population. So each of them, and so I say Columbus is the Phoenix of Ohio. So each has this different, and again, different voting patterns. So it's still a reliable model, but look at what the voting patterns are doing. So yes, the eye opener for me was the Mahoning Valley. I spent more time in that part of the state than any other, because the book begins in March of 2019 and it ends in March of 2020. And just as I was beginning my research and my travels, GM was shutting down the Lordstown assembly plant in near Youngstown. And one of the things that raised eyebrows 4 years ago was the fact that these reliable blue-collar Democrats who had voted twice for Barack Obama in very large numbers then turned and voted for Donald Trump in 2016. And it raised a lot of eyebrows among political observers. And so the time I spent there, when Lordstown was very much a raw nerve, when it was not settled, and Donald Trump had made a lot of promises that he was going to save those jobs and he was going to bring more manufacturing jobs to a region where manufacturing has been the blood and water of their existence. When that was not proving to be true, and when promises that were made were not being kept, the 201, the people I spoke with who had lost their jobs at Lordstown or whose families had been affected, said they would not vote for Donald Trump again. And so I expected that Trumbull County and that region in general would swing back toward its traditional voting patterns, and it didn't happen. And I did a panel last weekend with Sherrod Brown, who has much greater insight than I do into Ohio's politics. And I said, what do you make of that? And he said, I have no idea. He was the same as me, and Lorain County too. These blue collar, more urban areas where you would expect there to be more of a Democratic vote didn't go that way. And so I think that's what a lot of people who study this are going to be trying to break down. Because one thing I saw that that was an eye opener a few days ago was a county map and it showed the percentage of voter turnout in the counties that voted red versus the counties that were blue, and the percentages are much higher. There was much more enthusiasm, it seems, among the people who voted for Donald Trump than there was among people who voted for Joe Biden.
And I'm kind of curious because, again, I think know that the vote for the Democrats and Joe Biden and everything, while the people who actually showed up polling day and everything favored Donald Trump. And an interesting point, because you mentioned about 2018 kind of being the catalyst in your publicist's mind. Mark Weaver, who's no relation to me, but is a Republican strategist, said in a Columbus Metropolitan Club luncheon the day after the elections, when he said, I think it's wrong to call Ohio and now a swing state. He said, we're as reliably red as Indiana, with the exception of, for whatever reason, we can't beat Sherrod Brown. So he was saying, whenever Sherrod quits or dies or resigns or whatever and everything, he said, we've got a shot, but it's like, he is the one guy we can't, hit with the target. So, but I think Sherrod speaks to that. He's kind of like Ohio's version of Joe Biden.
Yeah, we trust our own. The polls, and I'm not going to believe polls as much as I have in the past, but the polls showed Ohio in the presidential race within a percentage or two difference between the two by election day. So I felt like we were still like this. We were a new version of bellwether in the sense that we were as divided as the country is, because there were such close margins. But then it turned out to be 8%. So I think everyone's still trying to get around it. But going back to that, Sherrod Brown is somebody who's trusted. I mean, for instance, I spent time with a farmer in Delaware County, reliable Republican, who and a conservative and a business person, who spoke very highly of Sherrod Brown, because he said he comes to see us, he comes to our farms and asks us what we need. And it seems very elementary, but that's in a state like Ohio, which has lost a lot of population. More people are here who've been here for a while, for a few generations, than other places that have a lot of sort of in and out migration. And so if somebody is trusted in that way, in that sort of organic way, or known in that sort of organic way, I think that they will always do well, because it's easier to trust a Sherrod Brown than it is a presidential candidate who drops in for a day and makes a promise, and we've been burned by enough promises that we might not do it. So I could see it very easily, another Democrat, coming up through the grassroots and emerging with that kind of. I would say that Ohioans feel similar about, regardless of political party, similar about Mike DeWine as they do about Sherrod Brown, even though they're very different politically, because they're people we've known for a long time, and they sort of hold the same value to us if you take party politics aside.
And again, I think retail politics, that was Mark Weaver said, that was the thing about Sherrod. He's a master of retail politics, of getting down the people know him, they know him. And again, the same thing, sort of like, the only person who's ever defeated Mike DeWine was Sherrod Brown in their Senate race in 2006. And yet when COVID hit and Mike DeWine became kind of like, the model of leadership on that, and he was working very closely and talking almost every day with Sherrod Brown, in that kind of like, okay, one's a Republican, one's a Democrat, but they're working together because in the end, they're problem solvers.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think they care more about the people of Ohio than they do, I would like to think that they do about their political party. And I believe that.
Did you find, and I wanted to ask, like, are the burning issues for people, are they the social things, the cultural issues like abortion or gay rights, or is it more the bread and butter issues, like, keeping my job, taking care of my family, seeing that my kids get educated? I mean, what in the end is the key thing, do you think, that makes people think when they go and pull that lever?
Well, I'm going to have a different answer than probably a pollster or political scientist would have, because my approach with Barnstorming Ohio was driven primarily by something I've recognized for a long time, which is that Ohio has 18 electoral votes, and we have traditionally have been a swing state. And so any of us who've lived here for a long enough time recognizes that 3 out of every 4 years, the rest of the country isn't sure if we're Ohio or Iowa. They like either don't, we're just sort of flyover country, or they lean on very superficial stereotypes, the few things they know about us. And so we're, like we're not well understood, if at all. And then that 4th year, when everybody either wants something from us or wants to like unlock the secret of where the country's headed, we get to send it upon. And so our narrative gets told to the country from the outside. And so Barnes, Ohio was driven by an instinct to tell this, not only to tell the story very much from the inside, but also not to turn real people into types, into people who would fit a poll profile or a demographic profile or partisan profile. So I went to people who I felt would represent parts of the national story, but I made clear that I wanted them to tell their story on their own terms as an individual, and get to stand as an individual in ways that people don't very often get to in political seasons. So what I came away with was a sense less about issues per se and more about kind of a deeper, more organic truth. And that truth surprised me because it came in similar words from very different kinds of people. And the main truth was that if we want to still believe in a notion of what America is, which is like a small town, maybe even Norman Rockwell image of people who live in a community that exists and helps each other out, that we need to think about what we do on a daily basis, that we can't just go out and live in a way that the world makes easy for us. And so I'll give you 3 very quick examples of 3 different people who told a version of that story. The first is a guy named David Green, who was the union local president at the Lordstown plant, a very strong Democrat, traditional union Democrat. And we were talking, and one question that I asked almost everybody I talked to, I asked a version of this question, which is, what should people know about you and what should politicians know about you that they might not know? What would you want them to know? And when I asked him that, he said, no, I want them to know where their car is manufactured when they buy it. It doesn't matter if you buy a Honda, know that it was assembled in Ohio, because Honda's going to get rich no matter what. And your money doesn't mean that much to Honda. But if you put your money in with the knowledge that you're feeding a family in Ohio or in Wisconsin or wherever American assembly is done, you're making a big difference. So then I'm having a conversation with this farmer I mentioned earlier in Delaware County, not far from where you are, but very much in the green part of Central Ohio. And he said, we've reached a point where most Americans probably think that their food was manufactured in the back room of the grocery store, or that they're ordering their food online. They're not even interacting with the chain of supply. And he said, know where your food was grown, because it can make the difference between whether you're sustaining Ohio's farms or the Midwest's farms, or whether you're sustaining a foreign supplier or whatever. Both of them, be mindful about these daily decisions and sort of generational decisions that you're making. And then I'm having a conversation with somebody we were talking about before we came live here, a young woman named Leyland Fowler, who was the manager of a bookstore in downtown Mansfield, small town, Ohio. And she said that she had lived in New York City, she had lived in Washington, D.C., she had lived in Boston, but was a native of Mansfield, and decided as she was nearing the age of 30 to move back to her hometown of Mansfield. A conscious decision to move back to a kind of America that she wants to live in, small town Ohio. And she said when she gets up every morning in her downtown Mansfield apartment and leaves and would walk to work at the bookstore, that she would feel like she was almost like on Sesame Street. Like all of the other shopkeepers would be out there in the morning and sweeping the sidewalk, Mr. Hooper, and wave hello and say hello to her. And she said that's a kind of America that people want to believe still exists. But she said, I look at this, she had to sacrifice the glamour of the big city. She had to sacrifice, she's managing a bookstore in downtown Mansfield, Ohio. You could probably guess that her paychecks were not very big, if they existed at all, someone's. But she was staying true to an ideal, making these mindful decisions about how she was living her life to maintain an ideal of America. And each of them, very, very different people, was saying the same thing, that whatever we think about, like the big controversial issues that we talk about in election years, those things are not as, I think, important in the true American life as what we do on a day-to-day basis and how we act to other people. In a way, you can end war probably. You and I probably could end war, could have more ability to end war if we're just nice to somebody tomorrow. Like that's the change we can make, as opposed to the big global questions.
Well, that's great. I want to say for everybody who's listening to us tonight, you do have, I think, either down at the bottom of your screen or on the side of your screen, a Q&A. If you would like to ask a question, that would be great. And I'm so happy because we've got one right now from our pal Jeff Kellett in Athens, Ohio. What's David's take on rural Ohioans' support for Trump? Because he's really nothing like them at all. And as Jeff notes, he is a crass, vulgar, boastful, mean-spirited New York City millionaire. What do hardworking, decent, religious country folk find so appealing in him?
I have the same question. I asked that question of a lot of people too. And very often it would be, I'm a conservative and he's a conservative. I don't like everything he says on Twitter, but there's a set of values that I have that they believe that he upheld. I'm religious. He is working to undo abortion laws. Like things that lined up with important values. And then, but almost always would have to say, so I have to, put aside the parts of him that don't match who I am or what I believe in. So most of the answers that I heard were answers that involved some kind of a compromise. And I wanted to be really careful not to judge it positively or negatively the people I talk to, because I find one thing I found through writing about myself a lot is the more I try to understand myself, the more I realize how contradictory I am in my own life, like how many things in my own belief system and my own daily activities sometimes counteract each other. And I really think humans in general are each a set of contradictions and a set of paradoxes. And so to look at those maybe even superficial paradoxes, I'd rather try to understand them. And so I had a lot of different versions of that observation as I went through meeting people around the state. And, in fact, I'm the older I get, the more suspicious I am of anyone who believes anything absolutely, especially a politician. So, in a way, I wish Donald Trump would, I don't know if I wish this, but in a way, I think Donald Trump would be more honest if he would say, yes, I'm a set of contradictions, but I'm not going to get into the self-awareness though.
Yeah. Well, but like I said, and for example, I love the chapter about Jim Renner, whose son has been an author at the Ohio Book Festival with True Crimatic and several of his books, and that was, like I said, again, a guy who, if you look at, was the traditional blue collar worker, rose through the ranks, had a good life, was a solid Democrat, and then cast his first vote, not Republican, but cast his first vote for Republican for Trump, even though he really doesn't like the Republican Party.
Right.
Total contradiction.
I'll tell you a quick story, since we both know Jim Renner is a writer in Ohio, and I've known him for quite a while. And we were doing a book event just as I was beginning the concept of Barnstorming Ohio, and I ran into him, and we were just catching up, and I told him what I was working on, and he's like, oh, and he's like, my dad was lifelong Democrat, hippie, steel worker, union foreman in the union, and now he's wearing a MAGA hat and he's all in on Trump, and I'm like, I want to talk to this guy because I want to understand somebody who is that. And so I basically opened the book with him because he's exactly what I wanted, was somebody who was not an easy answer, somebody who wouldn't have because there is not an easy answer, not just to the Trump effect, but to the times we're living in. And if there was, we would want to solve the times we're living in, because we're living in such a divided time, and such a time where people don't seem to be acting in their own self-interest or best interest. And here was a man who was very honest about his own contradictions. He's like, I love Donald Trump, but I hate the Republican Party. But I think the Democrats are crazy. And in a way, he was kind of speaking a lot of truth, even though you couldn't add him up to something that would, he would probably, if a pollster started to try to unravel him, the pollster would melt into like just a puddle and just like break down and smoke coming out of it. It would just break the machine. But he's a real person,
Yes, and that as Brian Williams put it this way, people who will vote for an arsonist for fire chief, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And yet we've seen a lot of that now. And here's another follow-up question. This is interesting because you talk about, your son, Evan, who just became an Akron City policeman, and a question, because he obviously has to deal, Akron is at times a very troubling city. What role do you think racism has played in Ohio going red?
I would say the same role it's played in other places. I think I think one of the things that Donald Trump uncovered was that he was saying or implying a lot of things that people felt like they aren't allowed to say, and he was giving them agency to express a racism that was already here. I don't know if it's better that it was just kept quiet or that it's become more public and present. But it's a fact that it has become more public and present. And you've got, a president who has been blowing dog whistles, and you see what happens when that dog whistle blows. We see it come to the surface. So it's a very troubling part of where we're living. And I should say, a quick update. So my son was beginning the police academy on the day the book opens. The book opens with him coming, home for the first time wearing an Akron police uniform. And he just very recently, his long-term career goal has been to be a firefighter paramedic. So he's just begun working as Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio firefighter paramedic. So he's made that transition. But he spent a year and a half on the streets in some of the most racially troubled neighborhoods in Akron, in a year where public demonstrations were taking place. He was there on the street, doing security for the march that went through Akron, took a knee with the other police officers and with the leaders of the Black Lives Movement march that day. It went through, Akron's having a record year in homicides. It's been really violent year in a lot of cities. And what he has given me through his experience is access to the front line of that difficult conflict that we're dealing with right now. And a different way of thinking about it, because I've had to think about the Black Lives Matter movement and the Blue Lives Matter movement as somebody who wants to understand both sides. So in that way, his story has been, is part of the book, but has been part of my own understanding of things. David, I see that your video has gone off, and I'm wondering if you've got an internet issue, but let me see if I can access the Q&A. So I see a question from George Bauman. Given that the urban worker dissatisfaction with Trump mentioned in your book did not give the state to Biden, do you see any path that Ohio Democrats can turn Ohio blue? That's a great question. Oops, hang on a second.
And David is back now.
Okay, yes, I see that. So David, I took over. You're no longer needed here.
Good, yes.
So I'll answer that question. So one of the things that I think Ohio is going to be coming to terms with now with the new census is it's insane gerrymandering map.
Yeah.
Ohio is one of the most gerrymandered states in the country. And so it looks more red than it is. That doesn't explain the swing towards Trump. And I don't know if that's the Trump effect, and that if a viable Democratic candidate who appeals to the concerns of Ohio will bring it back toward blue. But I think and hope that the state's electoral map is going to look different after the next round of gerrymandering. And if you know what's happened in the past year or so, the map was declared unconstitutional.
Yes.
And so it's been in attack in the courts by bipartisan judges. So that story is in play, and I hope it will represent a more realistic version of what the state looks like. But that doesn't change the individual people who live wherever the district maps, break them down. Those people are still here. So I don't know. My instinct is that we are still more, I don't want to say we're a purple state, but my description is we're a red, blue, red, blue, red, blue, red, blue state. I think we have more of a pattern here than the map reflects.
Well, and of course, the fact is that even though Ohio went twice for Trump, previously it went twice for Barack Obama. Was the reason for that black turnout was greater? I'm not really sure and everything about that, but it's because you couldn't pick two more different people, and yet they each won the state twice, handily, both times. So it wasn't just like a squeaker and everything. They both won by healthy each time. So, and you would
Yeah,
have thought, especially, yeah.
Go back to Trumbull County, and Trumbull County was 38% Republican in 2012 when Barack Obama was running, and it went 54% for the Republican candidate this year. So that's a huge swing. And in only 8 years, well, people don't change that much in 8 years. So, but something is playing different. So I don't know.
Interesting. Tim Ryan, who I know you talked for your book, was for a time, a candidate. Tim was saying the other night, I just watched him in an interview, and he was talking about, some people were surprised, how the majority in the House, for the Democrats went down. And Tim was saying, I can tell you that my winning percentage was down. And he said, I got hit with $1 million worth of ads in my district. He said, linking me to defund the police, which I have never supported. He said, so there's some issues and he said that are not going to play in my district. And he said, even though some of the more progressive and far left, in our party really want to push those things, I can tell you, they're not winning issues and they're not going to be winning issues in 2022.
Yeah. Well, in the same way that the appeal to Cuban voters in Florida was Joe Biden's a socialist, which Joe Biden's no more a socialist than I am, but that, again, it plays to the ears of those voters who have a very good reason to fear socialism. Tim Ryan gave me some really valuable insight into the appeal to the voters in his district in Northeast Ohio, the Mahoning Valley. He's my congressman. I'm in Akron, but even at that, help me understand it better. He said that the Democratic messaging in 2016 was, why would you want to vote for somebody who uses bad language and is rude and, wears ill-fitting suits and he's, uncouth. And he said, I'm around mill workers. He's like, we swear, and it made me remember that a couple of years ago, somebody did this survey and somehow determined that Ohio was the most foul-mouthed state in the nation, that we cuss more than anybody else. And I was really proud of that. I don't know why. Maybe it's because we never get to be first in anything, so I'll take it where I can get it. Because I root for the Cleveland Browns. So, but he was right. He's like, he said these are mill workers. He said they're not turned off by a rude, coarse speaking person. That's not going to play very well. And he said Democrats are very hard on the fracking industry for environmental concerns, which are very valid. But he said, this is an industry that's replacing a huge loss, a huge hole, not only in the economy, but in the spirit of the people who live where he lives. There's an emptiness, a void there that's existed for 2 generations with the loss of those steelmaking jobs that defined that region. And when something's coming back, this goes back to that notion of contradictions. You can't just say fracking is bad because it's bad for the environment, or that it's just good because it's good for the economy. You have to accept that these things are in delicate imbalance or balance, depending on how you look at it, and find a way to message it that doesn't demonize something that people find very valuable. And guns, he said, the people I live around, they go hunting and they think of guns as a very wholesome American thing, family thing. And, and that has to find some sort of a conversation with gun control and so forth. And so he said, so you bring a guy in who's says, I'm an outsider. I'm not like all these politicians who've been lying to you for all these years, and look how your life is going now. You could see the appeal, and it clearly was still there.
It's a sort of like, a mutual friend of ours. In fact, somebody who's a former student of yours was one of our Marvin winners, Elise Collette Goldback. And the wonderful book that she wrote that was a great success this year, Rust, about her time as a steel worker. And she's saying how she was really very much politically in every way different from the people that she was working with, and I was thinking, that when she was describing the mill workers, I was thinking these are the people who, I'm much older than you, in 1969, Richard Nixon called the great silent majority. The people that worked, they weren't college graduates, they held jobs, in auto plants and other places of that nature. Many of them had served, in World War II. And so while they were traditional Democrats, the thing was like, there were things going on in the country, riots, protests and everything that really bothered them. And that Nixon kind of like, hit a chord with them that I think, has kind of like, played well ever since for the Republican Party.
Yeah. One of my takeaways from this last election season is the intense emphasis on how divided we are. And so, and everything we see, it seems, in the news and in social media is the extreme. So you see these images of protests that the camera gets up close and tries to see where it looks the most violent. And, images of other public events that are on the extremes. And most of us aren't in those protests. And to me, the silent majority right now is the middle. And I think the middle is larger than we're perceiving because we spend so much time at the margins, at the far edges. And, even as somebody who considers himself a moderate, I know what my social media looks like, and it looks like only one slice of American life. I don't think it's healthy. And I'm someone who can at least put it into context. I think most people who are participating in what we think of as public discourse right now don't have access to a healthy version of it.
I was thinking about the fact, that none of the people that you wrote about, nobody says, I want to get the hell out of there. I mean, you and I are Ohio kids. I'm from Columbus, you're from Akron and everything. And I don't see people that are dying to like move away. I know they've said younger people are more and everything, but I was thrilled to know that, like, Leah and Evan, your two kids, want to stay here. My daughter Julia, who is now living in Texas, is moving back with her family, so it's whatever its problems, a lot of these folks, they don't want to leave. This is home.
Yeah, people are going to leave Ohio. I mean, I've come to grips for a long time ago with the migration pattern and the realities of what we call brain drain. But the whole premise of my book, The Hard Way on Purpose, was we always talk about the number of people who've left Ohio. And in my hometown of Akron, I've always been aware that the population we've lost a third of our population in my lifetime. And that premise was who's telling the story of the 2/3 who haven't left? Who's telling the story of the people who've committed to the Rust Belt cities and the Rust Belt states? And there are millions and millions of us. That story, and that story also pervades Barnstorming Ohio, which is a kind of pride in living in a place that's been through hard times. And that's a kind of pride that is deeper, I think, than a pride that you could take in moving to a city where you think your life is easier or has more opportunity. And that's not to denigrate anybody who picks up and moves to Chicago or to Phoenix or to Texas or whatever. It's just to say that this is a narrative that needs to be told as well. And the person I spent the most time with over the course of that year is a young man named Leonte Cooper, who was in community college in Akron. He had been in the military. He had gone through some struggles in his younger life with drugs and alcohol, and was nearly kicked out of the Army, and then turned his life around, ended with an honorable discharge, enrolled in community college in Akron, and was making the transition to the Ohio State University. Last fall, as I was telling his story, to study political science. And he wants to stay in Ohio and make a difference. That was the first thing he said to me, and that has remained kind of his story. And so I really wanted to understand him, and to understand, here's a human version of hard times who knows, who sort of is a microcosm, a mirror of Ohio's hard times, and who's finding a hard-won optimism, not only about his own life, but about the state and a place that he cares about. And his story was just unfolded before my eyes over the course of that year, and that's why I kept going back to him. And he's the last person I visited just as I was finishing writing the book, and it was after he had finished his first semester. It was last winter in Columbus, and he gave me hope, and he gave hope to the end of the book. And he's the same age as my children, and so he represented their story, I think, for me. Because one thing I found as I was really thinking about this is I realized that as I'm reaching an age where, when I think about my vote and when I think about what a presidential election means, I'm not thinking about myself so much anymore. I'm thinking generationally. I'm thinking about not what's going to happen over the next 4 years, but where's the country going to be when my children are coming into their own, and more largely, what's our future, and I mean our longer term future.
Yeah. Before we, as we wrap up with David, I just want to say again, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to lob them. I wanted to share with David. So last year, David McCullough was a guest for our 90th anniversary of his book, The Pioneers. And he said, somebody asked him, and he said he was a short-term pessimist, but a long-term optimist. How do you, is that kind of like how you would describe this time?
I have always self-defined as an optimist. Throughout my journalistic career and just throughout my just daily life, I've always thought of myself as an optimist. And as I spent this year traveling the state and seeing how deep the divide is, more through the frustration in the voices of the people I was talking to who feel like they can't even communicate. People felt, when they would start to talk about who they were voting for, they felt they had to speak in code. Like even though I was trying to give them as much agency as I could, people feel almost muted by the culture right now, because they feel like if they say anything that's different from what the person on the other side believes, that they can no longer communicate. And I began to feel a true sense of despair, a true sense of my own version of that same frustration. So I think I remain a long-term optimist, in great part because of Leonte Cooper and my hopes for my own children, that this is a thing we're going through. And that if we get somebody who's less divisive, not just one somebody, but more leaders who are less about the division and more about, more important things and longer term goals, that we can right that. I quoted, of all people, Warren Buffett. I just happened to get a chance to hear him speak in Cleveland just a couple years ago. And it was so great to hear somebody who's so far removed from our own reality speak in such a common sense way. And Warren Buffett just said, in this like matter-of-fact voice, he said, we get caught up in the moment. He said, America is going to be okay because America has always found a way to be okay. And it seems almost like a simple aphorism, but to hear it from somebody who's lived so much and has in a position of power and seemed wise when he said it, it really rung true to me that, that that's one thing we've always done is endure, and we've been through the Civil War and we've been through the Great Depression and a pandemic of 100 years ago, and we've been through the civil rights era, and we're going through another one of these really tumultuous, divided times, but we have endured. And so I hope that Warren Buffett is correct.
Indeed. So, and on that note, on an optimistic note, and thank you, David Giffels, for being with Ohioana. The book, Barnstorming Ohio to Understand America. You can get a signed copy of that, courtesy of our partners, the Book Loft of German Village. And David, it's been wonderful. I wish we could have been in person. So I do want to tell people that the final event for the Ohioana Library coming up will be December the 9th, when our quarterly book club will be meeting on December the 9th from 10 a.m. to noon to discuss Gloria Steinem's My Life on the Road, which was a 2016 Ohioana Book Award finalist in nonfiction. Gloria from Toledo, which is one of the 5 Ohios that's like more like the true Midwest of the upper Midwest. So thank everyone for coming. I want to say thanks to the staff, Catherine Powers, Courtney Brown, and Morgan Peters, who got us set up for everything. David, my friend, I hope the time will come when we can see each other again, and all the best to you and Gia and Leah and Evan. So,
well, thank you, David. It was great to see your smiling face again, even if from afar. And thanks to the staff, and thanks as well to the Book Loft, a great partner and one of Ohio's great independent bookstores. So support your local bookstore and your library.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, everybody. We will see you again. Everybody stay safe and have a safe and wonderful Thanksgiving.